Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to my channel where I talk about how I've healed my adrenal fatigue and chronic fatigue by healing old emotional wounds, emotional trauma from my early life, and the emotional toxicity that came as a result of those traumas and wounds from my past that were trapped in my body, and how I've been going in and identifying them with my symptoms to reach the emotion, access the emotion so that I can bring it into me and incorporate it by loving and accepting it and bringing it into my being as a whole. Integration is what we're going for. And how we do that is through acknowledgement, love, acceptance, and gratitude. Sounds so easy, right? But if you've been following me, if you're on this channel, or if you've been trying to heal yourself this way, or if you know anything about this area, you know it is not easy. And if you've ever been frustrated by people telling you to just love yourself, it's a lot harder than just loving yourself. Oh yeah, oh I forgot about that. Oh thanks. No, it's not that easy. It's actually a long process when you have core wounds and core traumas around love and safety. And the truth is, most of us do. Today, I'm talking about chronic fatigue syndrome in particular. On this channel, a lot of times I talk about both adrenal fatigue and chronic fatigue because they have so much in common. And also because I had both. And so healing them became sort of an intermingled process. And it's only been in the later stages of my healing that I've been able to separate out the two. The interesting thing about both chronic fatigue and adrenal fatigue is the answer to both is in your nervous system. Today, I'm going to talk about chronic fatigue syndrome and a different way of looking at it than I've heard elsewhere, but I know that this is true because of my own experience, so I hope it's helpful for you. When we're thinking about chronic fatigue, what it actually is your body is stuck in the freeze state. And I'm going to go into depth about what that means. You're probably familiar with fight or flight state, the sympathetic state. More recently, there's gotten to be a lot more attention to this freeze state because of the polyvagal theory that came out in 2011 and that just revolutionized all kinds of things. And people started linking it to trauma and understanding that there are actually 3 responses of our nervous system, not just the 2. So the 2 were parasympathetic, which is rest, digest, and heal, where we all sort of aim to be most of the time when we feel safe and secure. The second is the sympathetic state, right? That's fight or flight. It's elevated arousal. So if we perceive there's some sort of danger or sort of urgency, our heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases. There's a lot of arousal that happens in the body. Again, there's some perceived danger or urgency that just pushes us to go. Our eyes get dilated. What's interesting is what's becoming more and more understood in more recent years is this freeze state. That is another level of arousal. So you're in rest, digest, and heal, and then something happens and it triggers you into the fight or flight response. Well, what happens if you can't deal with whatever needs to be dealt with, the danger, the urgency, whatever it is, with that state, eventually you enter this freeze response. The freeze response is when we're triggered by a state of danger that is too big for us to respond to, too big for us to deal with, too big for us to escape or resist. And so we see this in nature. If there's danger to an animal, a predator is chasing a prey, the prey will run and run and run. That sympathetic response will allow the prey to either fight the predator or flee. But if the animal perceives that it's about to be caught and killed, it goes into a freeze response and it's basically playing dead. Everything is immobilized. There is this element of collapse within the body. So what I've realized as I've studied these illnesses more and more over the years and gotten into deeper and deeper, so I first made this realization with adrenal fatigue. What happens that creates adrenal fatigue is your nervous system becomes almost stuck because it becomes trained to be in the sympathetic nervous system response all the time. Because you have trauma and your trauma is being triggered throughout your day. This is very common with attachment trauma because attachment trauma has to do with your attachments, your relationships, and it can blanket other areas of relationships with other people, places things like money, things like work, things like time, where your relationship with other things becomes manifested from that original attachment trauma. And so when you have attachment trauma, those triggers can pervade your everyday life. And so you are being sent into a sympathetic response without you even realizing it on a daily chronic basis. And you don't realize it because you get so used to it and our body just acclimates and adapts to it. So your adrenals are pumping out the cortisol and adrenaline, these fear response, these danger response hormones. And so eventually your adrenals become so fatigued. They're not really fatigued, but your brain makes the decision to stop producing all those hormones because it's not working anymore. So what's happening is you're getting this constant input, threat, whether you're conscious of it or not. Most of us are not. And what happens is it turns off the mitochondria. Mitochondria are getting the signal, we're under threat. And so we need to go into cell defense mode and not spend all of our energy producing energy for the body to function. And so over time, you get more and more fatigue. This is what happens with adrenal fatigue. This is how you become fatigued over time. So what's interesting is in adrenal fatigue, when that happens long enough, you eventually enter this freeze state in certain areas of your body because the sympathetic response, you've been in the sympathetic response for years and years, it's not working. But you're still under threat. If you don't go and heal this trauma, you're still getting triggered all over the place. So one of the things we do is we shrink our lives, right? And that protects us from some of the triggering that we were getting, and that helps. But our lives are shrinking, and we don't want that either, and that makes us miserable. That might be another trigger for you, of feeling trapped, of feeling victimized, of feeling helpless. But the body is getting the message, this isn't working, and we need to elevate this response, this arousal response. And so then you enter this freeze state. It's like a permanent freeze state where the fatigue becomes overwhelming. It stops functioning. So in the sympathetic response, your heart rate goes up. There's a lot of activation and arousal. But in the freeze response, everything down regulates, everything comes down, everything slows down, comes down. Your bodily functions slow down. Now, there was already some slowdown in the sympathetic state because of that mitochondrial shift that I was talking about, that mitochondrial shift into a cell protection mode, out of energy production mode. And so your digestive slowing down, your brain slowing down, all these systems are slowing down, but you're in that activated state. But when you enter the freeze state, your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down, everything goes down, and you continue to lose mitochondrial function to create energy for you. So I was aware, and I talk about it in the adrenal fatigue recovery course that I am making and will be available down below when it's ready. But what I realized more recently is how chronic fatigue is connected here. So there was one piece that I was sort of missing. I was thinking, well, with chronic fatigue syndrome, it's not connected with the sympathetic response. What is the connection with the nervous system? The question becomes with chronic fatigue syndrome, there isn't that stage 2 of adrenal fatigue and some of stage 1 where it's ramping up. Stage 2 of adrenal fatigue is when you're in that wired and tired state. You're in a sympathetic state chronically, and that's what leads you into the freeze state. So what about chronic fatigue that actually isn't associated with that fight or flight response? What's happening there? What's happening there with the nervous system? Well, this is what's so fascinating to me. The key is understanding the polyvagal theory. The polyvagal theory that I referred to earlier is this 3-part system. What's interesting is there are 3 pathways: the ventral vagal pathway, which ventral means front, the sympathetic nervous system, and then the dorsal vagal response. Now, the ventral vagal is the parasympathetic response, sympathetic is sympathetic, and then the dorsal vagal response is that freeze response, which is so interesting because it's not actually the same system as the sympathetic. In fact, it's actually the same nerve. It's this vagus nerve that you may have heard of. If you're familiar with the vagus nerve, that's associated with the calm, all the wonderful things we want. It's the calming, it's the healing, it's the resting, it's the digesting. The vagus nerve connects to like all of our organs and systems. It's got these little fingers, everything. And it comes behind your ear from your brain down into all your systems. So this is talked about the vagus nerve. But what about this dorsal vagal side? which is the rear, the back of this vagal pathway. Isn't that fascinating that it's still the vagal pathway, it's just the opposite side. It's the dorsal side that creates the freeze response. So what's fascinating to think about is, okay, well, what if the nervous system learns to skip over the sympathetic response, not go into the sympathetic response, or for some reason it can't or won't, and it's under threat, so it just all in one motion goes into the dorsal vagal response, the freeze response. So there's really not much sympathetic response in your nervous system. When it's triggered, it goes straight into the freeze response. So what I'm getting at, this is fascinating because what I'm getting at is that chronic fatigue syndrome, what that really is from an energetic and emotional perspective, is your nervous system is stuck, is trapped in the freeze response. Not dissimilarly to severe adrenal fatigue, but there's a different mechanism because that happened over time, and it's actually easier and faster to heal because you can reverse the process by calming your nervous system. And you can do that with chronic fatigue, but it takes a lot longer because once your body enters the freeze state, it's much more difficult to get it back down to the parasympathetic response. You've got to do calming techniques much longer because we're in such an extreme fear state that it's paralyzing. It's literally paralyzing. And it takes a lot to get your body to understand and get the message that it is safe, because it's crossed that threshold really far. And what's interesting is that in the freeze state, your brain down-regulates processing information dramatically. And so you can't really do verbal things with your mind. You can't really use your mind to get out of it. You have to use your body. So how I figured this out, the chronic fatigue syndrome is you stuck in the freeze state. There are so many parts of you, old parts and old traumas, that are putting you in this chronic fatigue state, is because as I've healed my chronic fatigue syndrome by healing past trauma, I originally started it to heal the adrenal fatigue, and then I continued it to heal the chronic fatigue syndrome symptoms that were remaining, is that I go in and out of the freeze response, and I have been spending more and more time in the parasympathetic state, less and less time in the freeze state. So it gives me this perspective of being able to see that actually what's happening when I get triggered, when there's a trauma that's triggered, that my body has the response to go straight into the freeze state, I can see it. It's taken me a long time, actually. It took me a long time to see that this is what is happening. That my chronic symptoms, any kind of chronic symptom that is energetically based, emotionally based, and is the result of trauma of some kind, is that some part of you is stuck in the freeze state. That once a certain emotion, a certain wound is triggered, and your nervous system is trained to go straight into the freeze state, because for some reason, your nervous system and your brain believes that it is inescapable, that fight or flight will do no good. You cannot get out of it. And this is life or death. So the sympathetic response and the freeze response, fight or flight and freeze, are both associated with life-death situations. But it's usually in an interpersonal dynamic. At least that's what I'm talking about on this channel. I'm talking about attachment trauma that results in chronic fatigue syndrome and adrenal fatigue. So just like what I always talk about, we've got to go back to childhood, because anytime your nervous system and your brain thinks that you are physically threatened, your life is being threatened, that your physicality is being threatened, but you're not actually being threatened, that is a wound that stems from childhood. If your body goes into either the fight or flight response or the freeze response because of something interpersonal or some dynamic, some situation in your life that's not actually physically harmful or threatening, that is a childhood wound, because when you're a child, everything is life or death, because your attachments are life, and insecure attachments could be death. You need your caregivers to survive. Once we realize that our bodies are being sent into a sympathetic response or a freeze response, then we go back to childhood when we start thinking, okay, why would this happen? So the freeze response is another way of responding to trauma. When you have trauma, there are two ways for your body to respond, your nervous system respond, and that's either the sympathetic response or the freeze response. The thing is, in order to have a response of a freeze, there has to be some reason that you're not going into a sympathetic response. Well, that's why attachment trauma is so fascinating. Because what if you're having an insecure interaction with a caregiver, one of your primary caregivers, and your nervous system wants to respond in this sympathetic response, fight or flight, and you get really angry at your caregiver or you want to run away, and so you might try one of those things. What if the response that you get is to withdraw love from you if you do that? If you throw a tantrum, if you start hitting your caregiver, if you run away from your caregiver, and the response you get is, I will not love you. I do not love you. I withdraw my love. There is zero acceptance. There is tons of judgment. There's shame put on you. What if all of these things are put on you and you get the message? The sympathetic response is not safe. It's basically saying the attachment needs of the child and the normal human defense for a threat are in conflict. And that is one of the ways that can result in the nervous system learning that the response for certain emotions, certain wounds being triggered are not acceptable, not safe, and that the sympathetic response actually puts you in more danger. So you're sent into a freeze response. The danger is so great, it shuts you down. Your whole nervous system shuts down in a sense. Your body shuts down, your muscles shut down, and you become frozen. The thing about attachment trauma is it's a little t trauma, which means it happens on a chronic basis. And so when your nervous system as a child learns to be sent into a freeze response over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, it does that to keep you safe, to keep that attachment safe as much as you can because your life depends on it when you're a child. Then your body goes on in life doing that without you ever realizing it. You are sent into a freeze state when that same emotion, that same trauma is triggered. And a freeze response is muscles go limp, they go weak, your brain shuts off, your body really shuts down, as I said. I mean, it really down regulates. If you are in a chronic state of that, that's happening over and over again, and you don't feel it, you don't know what's happening, you're used to it. What happens is that disrupts, distorts your energetic flow, the energy flow in your body. And whenever there's distortion and disruption and lack of efficient energy going to parts of your body, you develop chronic symptoms. This is the link. This is the energetic link between emotions and trauma and physical chronic illness and chronic fatigue and chronic symptoms. Any kind of chronic symptom that is emotionally and energetic cause, this is the link. This is the link. It's this freeze state. It doesn't mean that you are literally, it doesn't mean you look frozen. This happens internal. And it's so difficult to identify because this happens when we're children. And so we don't remember these things. We don't have images. We don't always have images and distinct memories of these things happening. But they happen during a time when our personalities are being formed, our brains are developing. So what happens was by the time you're an adult, this is the only reality you know. So what if you're overwhelmed with anxiety? What is anxiety? It's fear. And if that fear is from trauma and your body is trained to respond to that trauma by freezing, the freeze response, the dorsal vagal pathway, you're in a freeze state, but you don't realize you're in a freeze state. You're so used to it. And then it's a vicious cycle because then the experience of the shame, the embarrassment that comes with being blank, you're put on the spot and you go blank and you can't speak and everything doesn't work up here. And even your body is in this extremely threatened state, but it's all collapsing within. then it feeds on itself, because the next time you're in that situation, you have that memory of that happening to you, that shame and the humiliation that you felt, and that feeds it. It's going to make it worse and worse and worse. So over time, what happens is these traumas don't get better. They get worse. The pattern gets worse. The pattern of freezing gets more and more ingrained, because you're being shown, yeah, that is a really threatening situation to be in, and you're being put in it again. And so, freeze is the most elevated arousal state that the human body has. So it's going to just keep sending you into that freeze state. Those are cognitive examples, but this is true anywhere in the body, because when a certain organ or a certain area of your body does not get enough energetic flow, you start developing symptoms. That could be pain. That could be dysfunction. That could be little function. So that's what's so interesting. I mean, if you think of it like the fight or flight response is your body is activated and it's moving. The freeze response is you are super threatened, your body is activated, and it's all collapsing internally. And you're just sitting there. Well, we all know that energy is not created or destroyed, right? Well, what happens when all that energy is created? And then it's forced to stay in the body, and it's not dissipated. That's a healthy way to respond, is to move that energy, but you can't do that. So what happens? It wreaks freaking havoc in the body. It wreaks havoc. And I'll tell you, this chronic fatigue syndrome and severe adrenal fatigue are this freeze state. Some part of you is stuck in a freeze state. This is really important. This is really important to understand, because once you understand chronic illnesses and chronic symptoms that are rooted in energetic causes and emotional causes, which I believe all chronic illness and all chronic symptoms have some element of emotion and energetic disruption, because that's what's causing the location of that symptom. It's you have an energetic imbalance there. And that's why things that happen to us in our lives, so eating a bad diet your whole life, for example. Well, why does one system fail and not the other? Well, there's an energetic link. Energetics are so important. The energetics of your body are absolutely hinging on your emotional health. And your emotional health depends on how your body has responded to emotional traumas and wounding as children and throughout your life. And how we respond in our lives is how we responded as children most of the time. So this is very important stuff. We're talking about chronic fatigue. I mean, I'm talking about chronic illness in general, but I know without a shadow of a doubt that this is true for my chronic fatigue and my severe adrenal fatigue. And I'm not going to tell you that that's everyone's, and I'm not going to tell you that that's universal with everybody in every illness like this. But I'm telling you, this is true for me. I know I'm not alone. And so try this on for size and see, could this be true for you? One of the first ways that I started figuring this out is I started this process of linking all of my symptoms to a metaphor, because the body speaks to you in metaphors. So if you list all your chronic symptoms on a page on one side, and then on the other side, you just let your mind go, okay, if this symptom was a metaphor, what would it be saying? For example, muscle fatigue, muscle weakness. For me, the one I came up with is I'm powerless. I believe that I am powerless, and I have a powerlessness wound. That's the metaphor. If I were a metaphorical machine, which our bodies are, and I believed that I was powerless, what would I do to the body? I would shut down its muscle function. So you become literally powerless. That's just an example. But the one that started me on this whole vein of the freeze response is being chronically cold. And I would think about it and think about what are all the things that it could mean. And what I finally realized is I'm frozen. I'm literally frozen via the freeze response. There is enough of me, enough parts of me that are frozen that I am now always cold. I'm always frozen. It reaches this point, this is when you develop chronic fatigue syndrome and you have all these symptoms all the time. It reaches this threshold of enough of you is always chronically in this freeze response, that it really takes over the functioning of you so many of our systems are not functioning because so many of our symptoms are linked in some way to trauma in the freeze response and this link with mitochondria. And then over time with freezing, with going into the freeze response, that danger response, your mitochondria are going down, 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 offline to protect the cell instead of producing energy for us and our organs and our systems. So this is super important. This is super important if you have chronic fatigue syndrome or severe adrenal fatigue. It's so exciting to realize, like, what if this is an answer for you? What if this could explain something for you? Because then the key is like, now we can put this in the perspective of, okay, if I am stuck in the freeze response chronically, if my body and nervous system is stuck in the freeze response, then the question becomes not, what are the millions of things that I have to do to heal? Because that's how it feels, because so many systems are breaking down. It feels like it's like impossible. There's so much to deal with and so much to try to, and your body can't handle supplements and all these things. So it feels overwhelming. But now if you put it in this frame, it's like, if that's true, then now all I have to do is figure out, how do I get my body out of the freeze response? That's the question. That's the only question that you have to ask. Obviously, it's not easy, but it simplifies it. And complexity is like the death of all action, right? Somebody says something to that effect. But it's true, because when we feel immense complexity, we get overwhelmed and then we don't want to act. So if you want to heal, and I know you do because you're on this channel and you're seeking answers, simplifying it to, my body is in the freeze response and I need to get it to the parasympathetic response. So what are the tools that I can use to do that? I mean, there are things that you can find online. The answer, in my mind, how I did it, is through breathing, this parasympathetic breathing, this elliptical breathing that I talk about on other videos, and havening, which is a mind-body approach. And both of these are. So both of these are either touching the body or diaphragmatic breathing. Those are both body mechanisms, somatic approaches, and you have to use, when you're in the freeze response, you have to use somatic approaches because, as I said, your brain's not functioning. So you can't use verbal approaches. You can't use psychotherapy, for example. You have to use somatic therapy. And these two approaches, diaphragmatic breathing and havening, just using these strokes on your body that signal to your body in your body's language, you are safe. Because when you're in the freeze response, you can't tell yourself you're safe. It'll stop at the brainstem, and in fact, it might get pissed. I don't know. It's just like, it seems like you don't know. This is how it feels in my body. It's like, you don't know. You're wrong. It just feels like, it feels like it makes it worse almost. So it's like, you don't have to say anything. When you find you're entering the freeze response, a symptom gets worse, some part of your body is going into the freeze response. And so what we need to do is calm the body. And the two most effective ways that I have found to calm the body when you're in this freeze response of any kind, if you've got a symptom roaring up, is havening. And I talk about the way to speak words with havening, but you don't even have to speak words. You can just do the motions. You can just do the strokes. And diaphragmatic breathing. Diaphragmatic breathing is just like, that's the foundation of all calming techniques. I feel like it's the most important. It massages your adrenal glands, which put out danger hormones. And it is the best way I know to message to your body that you are safe without trying to cognitively tell your body you're safe, you're safe, you're safe. It'll just piss it off in my experience. If you're in a sympathetic response, sometimes that will work. I can tell myself I'm calm and I don't get an angry response. But when I'm in the freeze state, those kinds of phrases, like it like prods it on, it urges it to keep going for some reason. But I so sincerely hope that that was helpful. If it was, please like this video, comment below. Likes and comments are so helpful for helping the channel to grow and reach more people who might benefit from this information. And I'd love to hear what you think of this. So don't forget to do that if you found this helpful or resonated in any way. So subscribe to my channel if you feel called to, and I will see you on the next video. Take care. Bye.